The rotten apple was still on the kitchen floor. Lydia Penrose noticed it the moment she stepped through the back door. A single apple collapsed into itself with age. The skin gone, the color of old leather sitting on the wide plank floor beside the kitchen table, as if someone had set it down and simply never come back. Around it, the ghost of its decay had left a dark ring on the wood. How many years? She did not try to calculate. The estate lawyer had warned her on the phone. There is a structural irregularity in the foundation, he had said, the careful language of a man describing something he did not fully understand and was not certain he should be responsible for explaining. Unexplained voids in the substructure. I want to make sure you understand what you're accepting before you sign. She had asked him what he meant by unexplained. He had paused. Then I mean that the foundation survey identified spaces beneath the structure that don't correspond to any building permit or architectural record on file with the county. Spaces that shouldn't be there technically, that nobody has been able to account for. She had signed anyway. Lydia was 67 years old and she had spent 35 years as a manuscript archivist, and she had learned in that work that unexplained voids were not problems. They were invitations. Every archive she had ever worked contained spaces where the record was incomplete gaps that looked like absence, but were actually the shape of something that had been deliberately removed or deliberately hidden. You did not close a gap by ignoring it. You followed it down until you found what it was the shape of. She set her bag on the kitchen table and took out her notepad. Sterling Orchard had been producing apples since the 1890s. The Ruby Heart variety, the one that had made the Sterling name synonymous with premium orchard stock across 3 states for most of the 20th century, had been developed here on this land in the years between 1920 and 1928. The estate lawyer had mentioned this in the same tone he mentioned everything about the property as historical background context without consequence. The Ruby Heart patent had lapsed decades ago. The orchard itself had not been commercially productive since the 1970s. What remained was the farmhouse, the outbuildings, and approximately 40 acres of old apple trees that had been left to manage themselves for 50 years and had done so with the particular resilience of rootstock that knew what it was doing. She walked through the farmhouse slowly. The kitchen first utilitarian built for the serious work of a producing farm, the counters deep and practical, the shelving heavy. Then the front rooms, a parlor, a small office, a dining room with a long table that could seat 12, and had she imagined seated 12 regularly through the orchard's productive years. Everything in the house had been built for function. Nothing had been built for show. This was a working property, and every room said so. She stopped in the office. The desk was still in place, a large, flat-topped working desk, the surface scarred from decades of use. On the wall above it, a series of hooks where framed items had hung the lighter rectangles of protected paint visible on the surrounding surface. Removed, not lost. The hooks were still there, the hardware intact. Someone had taken the frames deliberately and had not bothered to remove the hooks they had hung from. She photographed the wall and moved on. The farmhouse smelled of old timber and cold stone, and underneath both of those something she identified after a moment as tannin, the particular dry astringency of apple skin and apple wood, and decades of proximity to a crop that had saturated the building's materials with its own chemistry. You could smell what this farm had been even now, 50 years after it had stopped being it. She found the first staircase behind the kitchen. A door beside the pantry, plain wood, the latch worn smooth. She opened it onto a staircase going down stone steps, the walls rough field stone, the smell of earth and old wood rising immediately. She descended with her flashlight. The first basement was exactly what a farm basement should be. A storage space, the walls lined with empty shelving, the floor packed earth, the ceiling low, but sufficient. Firewood had been stored here once she could see the markings on the walls where the stacks had rested. A root cellar in function, if not in name, serving the practical requirements of a farmhouse through long winters. She walked the perimeter of the first basement, slowly running her flashlight along the walls. In the far corner behind a wooden shelving unit that had partially collapsed a second staircase. Narrower than the first, the steps cut more carefully, the walls finished with a lime plaster that had not been applied to the first basement's walls. She moved the collapsed shelving aside and descended. The second basement was different in character. Cooler, the temperature dropped noticeable on the stairs and immediate at the base. The walls here were finished throughout the lime plaster, consistent the floor flagstone rather than packed earth. The shelving along the walls was built with more care than the level above the joints, tight, the wood protected from moisture by an oil treatment that had done its work and preserved the timber across decades of cold storage. This had been a serious preservation space, a controlled environment built for the long-term storage of something that required consistent temperature and humidity. Apple grafting records, she thought. Seed stock, the materials of a serious breeding program. She walked the second basement with her flashlight moving slowly across every surface. She found the door in the south wall. Not a shelving unit, not a concealed panel, a door steel, the kind she recognized from a specific era of American construction. Bank vault construction, the kind of door installed in financial institutions in the late 1920s and early 1930s, built to specifications that assumed the contents were worth protecting against fire, flood, forced entry, and time itself. Set into the fieldstone wall of a farm basement in rural orchard country, it was so entirely wrong for its context that she stood in front of it for a long moment, simply absorbing the fact of it. A single keyhole, no handle, the steel surface cold and perfectly solid under her palm. She took out her phone and called Thaddeus Blackwood. He arrived 40 minutes later, moving carefully down the 2 staircases with the deliberate pace of an 82-year-old man who had decided that being careful was more important than being fast. He carried a flat leather case. He had not seemed surprised when she called. He had seemed, if anything, relieved. He stood in front of the vault door and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he opened the leather case and took out a key. It was old brass, heavier than a standard key, the bow engraved with a small pattern she couldn't read in the flashlight beam. He held it in both hands for a moment, not ceremonially, but with the specific care of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to do and wanted to be certain he was ready to do it. Evelyn Sterling had spent 20 years being called unstable, incompetent, a woman whose judgment could not be trusted with her own property, her own work, her own name. She had not been unstable. She had been building this room. Thaddeus inserted the key into the lock. The fog came in low across the orchard, not the thick fog of deep winter, the thin particular fog of an October afternoon that settles into the branches of old apple trees and dissolves the line between the canopy and the gray sky above it. Lydia Penrose cut the engine and sat in the car for a moment, looking through the windshield at Sterling Orchard in the fading light. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the silence of abandonment. She had been in abandoned places and knew what that felt like, the particular emptiness of a space that had simply been left. This was different. This was the silence of a place that was holding something. The orchard rows stretched west in long, parallel lines, the old trees standing with the particular uprightness of rootstock that had been managing itself for decades without human intervention, the branches interlocking overhead in patterns that spoke to years of unguided growth. The remaining fruit, small, dark, unharvested, hung on the outer branches like punctuation in a sentence that had never been finished. She got out of the car and stood on the gravel drive. The farmhouse was white clapboard. 2 stories, the paint faded from white to the gray, of a color that had given up arguing with the weather. A wide porch wrapped 3 sides. Nothing about the exterior announced anything except function. This was a working house, built by people who understood that the orchard was the point and the house was the instrument. No decorative elements, no architectural flourishes, no attempt to impress anyone who might drive past on the county road. But Lydia had spent 40 years as a manuscript archivist, and she had learned in that work to read the space between things as carefully as the things themselves. Standing on the gravel drive in the October fog, looking at a farmhouse that presented itself as entirely ordinary, she felt what 4 decades of handling hidden documents had trained her to feel. The shape of something carefully concealed. She took out her notepad and went inside. The kitchen was utilitarian and unapologetic about it. Deep counters, heavy shelving, a long work table scarred from decades of serious use. The floor was wide plank oak, dense and dark with age. She walked it slowly, heel to toe, the way she walked floors she was trying to understand. It was sound throughout, except for one area near the pantry door, where the boards gave slightly under her weight in a way that spoke not to structural failure, but to something underneath them that was not solid earth. She noted this and moved to the pantry. The pantry door opened onto the first staircase, stone steps, rough field stone walls, the smell of earth and cold timber rising immediately. Standard farm basement access. She descended with her flashlight and stood at the base of the stairs, letting the space present itself. Root cellar. That was the correct category, the practical underground storage of a working farm, the shelving along the walls built for preserves and dry goods and root vegetables, the floor packed earth, the ceiling low but functional. She walked the perimeter, slowly measuring in her mind. She stopped. She walked it again, this time counting her steps with the particular attention of someone who had spent a career understanding that the dimensions of a container told you as much as its contents. Length, width. She came back up the stairs and walked the kitchen above in the same manner. Length, width. She stood in the kitchen and looked at her notepad. The first basement was substantially smaller than the kitchen floor above it. Not by a few inches, by a significant margin, the kind of discrepancy that could not be explained by wall thickness or stairwell placement. The footprint of the basement did not correspond to the footprint of the house. There was space beneath this floor that the first basement did not account for. She went back down. She worked the perimeter of the first basement more slowly this time, the flashlight moving along the base of every wall, looking for the thing that the dimensions had told her should be there. She found it behind the firewood. The stack was old, the wood had been there long enough to dry, past usefulness, the bark separating from the logs in long curling strips, the whole pile slightly collapsed into itself from years of settling. She moved the outer logs, carefully stacking them to the side, working toward the wall behind. Behind the last row of logs, set against the fieldstone wall at floor level, a wooden box. The trapdoor opened onto a staircase that had been built with more care than anything above it. Lydia descended slowly, one hand on the stone wall for balance, the flashlight in her other hand, moving across the steps below her. The wood was different here, not the rough-cut utility timber of the first basement, but dress planks, the edges smooth, the joints fitted with the precision of someone who understood that this staircase would be used in the dark and needed to be reliable in the dark. The walls on either side were finished stone, the mortar carefully pointed. Someone had built this entrance with the same attention they brought to rooms they expected to inhabit. The temperature dropped 4 degrees at the base of the stairs. She stood at the bottom and held the flashlight level and let the room present itself. It was not a root cellar. The shelving ran floor to ceiling along 3 walls, not the rough farm shelving of the level above, but constructed cabinetry, the kind built for a specific purpose by someone who had thought carefully about what that purpose required. Each shelf was fitted with a lip along its front edge to prevent jars from shifting. Each shelf was spaced to a specific height uniform throughout the spacing, too consistent to be incidental, calibrated to the exact dimensions of the glass jars that occupied them. Hundreds of jars! Lydia moved to the nearest shelf and held her flashlight close to the first jar. The glass was old, the slight blue-green tint of pre-war manufacture, the seal intact, the contents dry and preserved. Inside apple seeds arranged with the careful ordering of someone who understood that sequence mattered. On the front of each jar, a paper label, the ink faded but legible, in the direct beam of the flashlight, the handwriting small and precise and consistent throughout. Ruby Heart Generation 4. Cross RH 3 times. Cortland Select. 1924. She moved to the next jar. Ruby Heart Generation 5. Cross RH4 by Northern Spy variant. 1926. The next. Generation 6. 1927. The next. Generation 7. 1928. She walked slowly along the shelf, reading each label in sequence, the flashlight moving from jar to jar. The handwriting was the same throughout, not similar, the same hand across what she calculated was at least 15 years of labeling. Whoever had written these labels had written all of them. One person, one program, one sustained body of work, progressing generation by generation towards something specific. She looked at the far end of the shelf. Ruby Heart Generation 12, patent ready, 1928. She stood in front of that jar for a long moment. It was sitting in the center of the table as if someone had set it down between sessions and expected to return. She opened it to the first page and read the header in the same small, precise hand as the jar labels. The lid came away without resistance. Inside, resting on a square of oilcloth that had preserved it from the worst of the moisture, a key. Brass heavier than a standard key, the bow engraved with 2 letters and a notation in a small, precise hand. She held the flashlight directly over it and read the engraving. Issa Deeproot. She looked at it for a long moment. Thaddeus Blackwood arrived on foot. Lydia had given him the address when she called, had offered to send someone to collect him, had mentioned that the walk from the county road was longer than it appeared on the map. He had declined all of this with the particular brevity of an 82-year-old man who had decided that the manner of his arrival was the one thing in this situation he could still control. He appeared at the farmhouse door 40 minutes after she called, wearing a dark coat that had been good quality once and was still presentable, carrying a leather satchel worn smooth at the corners from decades of handling. She met him at the door. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked past her into the farmhouse with the expression of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment for a very long time and is now verifying that the moment has actually arrived. "You found the second level," he said. It was not a question. She led him through the kitchen and the pantry, and down the first staircase, and through the moved shelving unit, and down the second staircase into the preservation room. She watched him as he descended, watched his hands on the wall for balance, watched his face as the room came into view, watched the moment when he saw the shelving and the jars and the notebooks on the work table. His hands began to tremble when he reached the base of the stairs. Not dramatically, the small contained tremor of a man whose body was expressing what his face had been trained for 80 years not to show. He stood at the base of the stairs and looked at the room, and his hands trembled at his sides, and he did not attempt to conceal it. Lydia said nothing. She had learned in 40 years of archive work that silence was the appropriate response when someone was in the process of arriving somewhere they had been avoiding for a very long time. Thaddeus walked to the work table. He looked at the notebooks. He picked up the first one, 1918 E. Sterling, and held it in both hands without opening it, as if the weight of it was the information he needed rather than the contents. Then he set it down carefully and turned to face her. "I was Marcus Sterling's junior clerk," he said, "from 1948 to 1953. I was 22 years old when I started. I understood what had happened here before my first year was finished." He paused. "I told myself I was too young to act. Then I told myself there was nothing to be done. Then enough time passed that I was telling myself it was ancient history." He looked at the jars on the shelves. 50 years of different reasons that all meant the same thing. He set the satchel on the work table and opened it. Inside a collection of documents organized in the manner of someone who had been maintaining them carefully for decades, the papers in good condition, the organization deliberate, each section separated by a strip of heavier stock. He had been keeping this, she understood, against the day when keeping it would become doing something with it. That day had apparently arrived. Marcus never knew about the third level, Thaddeus said. He was removing documents from the satchel as he spoke, setting them on the table in a sequence that suggested a prepared order. He knew about this room. He knew Evie spent time in the basement. He assumed she was tending the seed stock, which suited him, because it meant the breeding program was continuing under the family name. He never came down here himself. He had no interest in the agricultural work, only in the commercial value of its results. He placed a folded document on the table, a surveyor's report handwritten dated 1955. "I found this in Marcus's files after he died. He had commissioned a structural survey of the property in 1955. The surveyor noted an anomaly in the foundation, a density variation in the soil beneath the second basement floor that suggested additional construction below. Marcus had annotated the report himself. He pointed to a penciled notation in the margin. She leaned in and read it. Disregard. Foundation settling. No action required. He either didn't understand what the surveyor was describing, Thaddeus said, or he chose not to pursue it. I have never been certain which. Either way, he did nothing. And whatever Evie had built down there remained exactly as she left it. Lydia looked at the surveyor's report and then at the hollow wall in the far corner. She hired workers from out of state, Thaddeus continued. I found the payment records in a separate ledger that Marcus had not cataloged. He missed it when he inventoried her assets after the competency declaration. She paid them in gold. Her own gold kept separately from any account Marcus had access to. He paused. She had anticipated that he would take her accounts. She had not kept everything in her accounts. He reached into the satchel one final time. He removed a key, not the brass key she had found in the wooden box behind the firewood. This was different in character entirely. Steel heavy the bow, substantial in the hand, the barrel long and precisely machined. The kind of key made for a mechanism that was built to last against determined effort. He held it out to her across the work table. The brass key you found upstairs opens the access panel in the wall, he said. It was the signal. Evie's instruction: if you found the brass key and understood the notation, you were meant to find this one. I have been holding it for 30 years, since I found it in a sealed envelope in the county archive with my name on it. Lydia took the steel key. It was heavier than she expected. She knew you, she said. She knew someone like me would exist eventually, Thaddeus said. Someone who had been in Marcus's office and had seen what was there and had done nothing about it for too long. She left the key where that person would find it. It took 30 years. He looked at the floor. I am not proud of the 30 years. Together they crossed to the corner wall. Lydia used the brass key on the small panel that the hollow sound had suggested, a fitted section of the newer brickwork that released when the key was turned, swinging inward, to reveal a cavity housing a simple latch mechanism. She released the latch. The section of wall, perhaps 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, built as a door, disguised as a wall, swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently enough to move without protest. Behind it, a staircase. Not stone steps, a spiral staircase of wrought iron, the construction precise and elegant, the kind of metalwork that required a skilled craftsman and had been crafted by one. It descended in a tight spiral into darkness, the air rising from below, distinctly colder than the preservation room, the cold of depth rather than the cold of temperature. Lydia held the flashlight over the opening and looked down. The spiral ran approximately 5 meters. She estimated the depth from the pitch of the stairs, and the distance before the bottom became visible in the flashlight beam. At the base, the staircase ended on a stone floor, and the floor opened into a space she could not fully see from above, except for the one thing that was immediately and completely visible from the top of the stairs, regardless of the angle of the light. A vault door. Circular steel, the diameter of the door approximately 4 feet, set directly into the stone wall at the base of the spiral staircase. The kind of door manufactured by bank vault specialists in the late 1920s and early 1930s, built to the specifications of institutions that required absolute security against fire flood and forced entry. The steel surface was cold gray in the flashlight beam, the locking mechanism centered on the face of the door, the manufacturer's plate visible above the mechanism. Around the entire circumference of the door, pressed into the gap between the steel frame and the stone surround, filling every millimeter of the join completely and uniformly. Candle wax. Old wax, yellowed with age, applied in layers that suggested multiple sealings over time, applied by someone who understood that the seal was as important as the lock, that keeping air and moisture from the contents over a period of decades required both the mechanism and the seal to hold. Lydia stood at the top of the spiral staircase and looked at the vault door in the beam of her flashlight. Evelyn Sterling had built this room below a room. Below a room, had hired workers from another state and paid them in gold, had constructed a spiral iron staircase and sourced a bank vault door and sealed it with wax and left a key with a 22-year-old clerk she had apparently assessed with sufficient accuracy to trust him to carry it for the rest of his life until the right person asked for it. She had not been delusional. She had been an engineer. Thaddeus inserted the steel key into the lock. The mechanism resisted not from failure, but from decades of disuse, the internal components stiff with the particular resistance of precision machinery that had been built to last and had lasted, and was now being asked to perform for the first time in a very long time. He applied steady pressure, not force his trembling hands, finding a surprising steadiness in the specific task, the way hands sometimes do when the task they have been waiting for finally arrives. The tumblers turned. The sound they made was dry and deliberate, the sequential engagement of a mechanism engineered in the 1920s to the specifications of institutions that could not afford failure, each component moving against the next, with the unhurried certainty of something that had been built correctly and had simply been waiting. The sound echoed in the narrow space at the base of the spiral staircase off the stone walls and the iron treads above them, and then the final tumbler seated itself, and the locking bar retracted, and the vault door moved. Not quickly. The door was 4 inches of steel, and it moved on its own terms, a slow, weighty arc inward, the hinges carrying the load without protest, the seal of decades of wax cracking along the circumference in a single continuous sound, like ice releasing in early spring. Cold air came out as the door opened, not the cold of the basement above, or the preservation room above that, but a deeper cold. The cold of a space that had been sealed against the world completely, and had maintained its own internal climate for 90 years, without reference to anything outside itself. Lydia held the flashlight into the opening. The room beyond the vault door was approximately 12 feet square. The walls were stone as expected, but lined throughout with sheets of lead fitted precisely to the stone surface, and soldered at the seams, the entire room encased in a material chosen specifically for its impermeability to moisture. The floor was stone dry as paper. The ceiling was stone, the same lead lining running across it without interruption. The air inside was the driest air she had ever stood in. Not sterile dry in the way of a space that had been engineered for preservation by someone who understood preservation at a level that went beyond ordinary caution. The lead lining the vault door, seal the depth below ground, each element had been chosen for a specific purpose and had performed that purpose without failure across 9 decades. In the center of the room, a table. Not woodstone, a single slab of dressed limestone set on 2 stone supports the surface level and smooth. The kind of table that would not warp, would not rot, would not expand or contract with changes in temperature or humidity. The kind of table built by someone who understood that the materials she chose would outlast every other consideration. On the table, a copper cylinder. Approximately 18 inches long and 4 inches in diameter, the copper darkened with age but structurally intact, the ends capped and soldered in the manner of archival document storage. A preservation tube, the kind used in the early 20th century for the long-term storage of documents that required absolute protection from moisture and atmosphere. The soldering at both ends was original unbroken, the seal intact. Beside the cylinder, arranged with the same deliberate care as everything else in this room, a leather portfolio closed and tied, the leather dried but sound, the binding cord still holding after 9 decades in the sealed air of the vault. Lydia set her flashlight on the table and reached for the copper cylinder first. The soldering at the near end required a tool. She used the small flat blade she carried in her archive kit, working carefully around the circumference of the cap, breaking the seal without damaging what was inside. The cap came free. She tilted the cylinder gently, and a roll of documents slid out wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them in the same condition as the day they were placed inside. She unrolled the oilcloth on the stone table. 3 documents, each one in remarkable condition, the paper firm, the ink fully legible, the official stamps and seals as clear as the day they were applied. The first was a patent certificate. Federal format, the official header of the United States Patent Office, the date of issue. November 14, 1928. She read the patent description, a detailed technical account of the ruby heart apple variety, its genetic characteristics, its development methodology, its distinguishing qualities as an agricultural innovation. She read the claims section, each numbered claim, describing a specific aspect of the variety that the patent was protecting. She read the name in the inventor field. Evelyn Rose Sterling, sole inventor, Sterling Orchard, Virginia. Not Marcus, not the Sterling family, not Samuel or the Colston estate or any other name. Evelyn Rose. Sterling named alone in the official record of the United States Patent Office as the sole inventor of the variety that had carried the Sterling name into commercial prominence for 3 decades, and whose theft had been the stated justification for the competency proceeding that had taken her property, her freedom, and her name. The second document was a letter of authentication from the International Agricultural Society, dated March 1929, confirming the Ruby Heart patent and acknowledging Evelyn Sterling's contribution to agricultural science. It had been signed by the Society's director and 3 senior members and bore the Society's official seal. The third document was a will. She recognized the format immediately. A legal will properly executed the structure of a document prepared by someone who understood the law and had taken care with every element. She read the header. Last Will and Testament of Samuel Edward Sterling. Dated August 3, 1931, 4 months before Samuel died. She read it slowly in full, every clause and every provision. Samuel had left everything to Evelyn. The farm, the orchard, the breeding program, the seed stock, all equipment and structures, all intellectual property, including the Ruby Heart patent, and any future varieties developed from the program. He had written in a handwritten addendum at the bottom of the final page, in language that was not legal terminology, but was entirely clear. Evie built this farm. Everything here is hers. It has always been hers. I am only confirming what was already true. The will Marcus had presented to the county court in November 1931 had left the estate to the Sterling Family Trust with Marcus as trustee. Lydia had seen a reference to this document in the estate records. This was a different will. An earlier will or a later one, she could not determine the sequence from the document alone, but the date was clear and the execution was proper, and it said exactly the opposite of what had been presented to the court. She set the will beside the patent certificate and looked at both of them together on the stone table. Thaddeus was standing at the vault door, not entering, looking in from the threshold, with the expression of a man who had spent 50 years imagining what was in this room, and was now receiving the confirmation of an imagination that, had it appeared, been entirely accurate. Lydia picked up the leather portfolio and untied the binding cord. Inside, 40 years of breeding records. Not the notebooks from the preservation room above supplementary records, the private documentation that Evie had kept separately from the official program records, the personal notations and observations and conclusions of a scientist who understood that her primary records were vulnerable and had maintained a second archive against the day they might be needed. Each page, dated, each entry signed, the handwriting, the same precise script she had been reading since she found the first jar label. She was setting the portfolio back on the table when she saw the mirror. It was small, a hand mirror, the kind a woman kept on a dressing table, the frame simple silvered metal, the glass intact. It had been placed beside the copper cylinder with the same deliberateness as everything else in the room, and beneath it, held in place by the mirror's weight, a single sheet of paper. She lifted the mirror. The note was written in the same hand as everything else in the room. The ink was faded but fully legible in the flashlight beam, the script as careful and precise as the jar labels and the breeding records and the will and the patent and every other document Evelyn Sterling had produced across a lifetime of meticulous work. To whoever finds me, look in the mirror. You are looking at the face of justice. Lydia read it once. Then she looked up from the note and looked at the small mirror in her hand. Her own face looked back at her, a 67-year-old woman standing in a sealed vault beneath a failed farm, holding a mirror that had been waiting 90 years for someone to pick it up. She stood with it for a long moment. Outside the vault door, Thaddeus made a sound that was not quite a word. She looked up. His hands had stopped trembling. He was looking at the patent certificate on the stone table, at the name in the inventor field, at the date at the official seal that had been pressed into this document in 1928 and had waited in a sealed copper cylinder in a lead-lined room under 3 levels of a farmhouse for 96 years to be read by someone who would understand what it meant. Lydia set the mirror back on the table. She looked at the note one more time. You are looking at the face of justice. If you discovered that your family had been living on a 100-year lie, would you choose silence or truth? Tell me in the comments. Julian Sterling came down the stairs alone. Lydia heard him before she saw him, the careful descent of a 74-year-old man on an iron spiral staircase, each step placed with deliberate attention, the sound of someone who had decided to come and was not going to be hurried by the difficulty of the approach. She was at the stone table, the patent certificate, and Samuel's will laid flat before her when his feet appeared on the lowest treads of the spiral, and then the rest of him followed into the flashlight-lit space at the base of the stairs. He stood at the bottom and looked at the vault door standing open. Then he crossed to it and stood in the doorway of the vault room and looked at the stone table and the copper cylinder and the leather portfolio and the documents laid out in the careful order she had given them. He looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he went down on one knee. Not dramatically, not the gesture of performance or theater. The slow, effortful descent of a heavy man with aging joints, lowering himself to the stone floor in front of the open vault door, because standing did not feel like the appropriate posture for what he was experiencing. He knelt on the cold stone and looked at the vault room, and his hands rested on his thigh, and he made no sound. Lydia said nothing. She had learned in 40 years of archive work the difference between a silence that needed to be filled and a silence that needed to be honored. This was the second kind. She waited. After a long moment, Julian raised his head. I knew it was here, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had been carrying a specific weight for a specific number of years and had finally arrived at the place where he could set it down. Not exactly here, not this room, not the vault. But I knew there was something beneath this farm that my grandfather had spent 30 years trying to find and couldn't. He told me when I was 19 years old. He paused. He was not a man who admitted failure easily. The fact that he told me at all was its own kind of confession. He pushed himself carefully back to his feet, the effort visible, and stood in the vault doorway with his hands at his sides. He called it Evie's insurance, Julian said. That was the phrase he used, always that phrase, never any other. He said she had built insurance against him somewhere in this farm, and that he had looked for it for years, and that if he hadn't found it by the time he died, it would destroy the family after he was gone. A pause. He was right about one of those things. Lydia set down the document she had been holding and looked at him directly. How long have you known about the 3 basements? I found the second level in 1987, Julian said. The preservation room, the jars and the notebooks. He looked at the wall behind her, at the open panel, the spiral staircase beyond it. I found the entrance to this level in 1991. I could see the panel. I understood what was behind it. He stopped. I never opened it. Why not? He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man choosing accuracy over comfort. Because I was afraid of what was in there, he said. Not afraid of the room. Afraid of what the room would mean for everything my family had built on top of it. The Sterling name, the orchard's history, the story we had been telling about who we were and where we came from. He looked at the stone table at the patent certificate with Evelyn Sterling's name in the inventor field. I told myself the past was the past, that Evie was dead and Marcus was dead and everyone directly involved was gone, and the only people left were people who hadn't done anything wrong. Another pause. I told myself that for 33 years. He crossed to the stone table and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He removed a metal box, small, the kind used for personal correspondence, the latch a simple mechanism, the surface worn from handling. He set it on the table beside the patent certificate without looking at either. My grandfather's private letters, he said, written to himself. Not to anyone else. Marcus Sterling wrote letters to himself in the last 30 years of his life, pages, and pages kept in this box which I found in his desk after he died. I have read them. He paused. I have read them many times. Lydia opened the box. The letters were organized chronologically. She could see the dates on the uppermost pages beginning in the early 1950s and running through the 1970s. She lifted the first one and read the opening lines. Marcus Sterling had been a precise man in his legal work. She had seen enough of his professional documents to know the quality of his formal writing, the careful construction of his legal arguments, the controlled language of a trained attorney. These letters were not that. These letters were the writing of a man whose control had been eroding for decades, the language becoming less precise and more circular. With each passing year, the same themes, returning again and again in slightly different configurations, as if he were trying to find an arrangement of the words that would finally resolve into something he could live with. He wrote about Evie's vault constantly. Not always by name, sometimes it was the room, sometimes the insurance, sometimes simply it. But it was present in every letter from the first to the last, a fixed point around which everything else in his interior life rotated. He described searching the basement in 1952 and finding nothing. He described having the foundation surveyed in 1955 and receiving a report that suggested additional construction below the second basement and choosing to ignore it. He described lying awake, constructing theories about where she had hidden things and what those things might prove and what they would mean if found. He described the specific quality of his fear, not the fear of legal consequence. By the 1950s, the statute of limitations had long since run on anything that could be prosecuted. The fear was something else, something he circled around in the letters without ever naming directly. She read it in the negative space of his language, in the gaps between what he wrote and what he was describing. He was afraid of being known, not punished, known. He was afraid that the room Evie had built would one day be found by someone who would understand what it contained and would therefore understand what he had done, not in the legal language of fraud and forgery and false competency declarations, but in the simple human language of what one person had done to another person who had trusted them. The last letter was dated March 1978, 4 months before his death. She has been dead for 47 years, and I'm still looking for the room. I will die looking for it. She knew I would. That was the punishment, not the law, not exposure. She gave me the knowledge that the proof existed and the certainty that I would never find it. She was always smarter than I gave her credit for. That was my first mistake, and it never stopped being true. Lydia set the letter down on the stone table. She looked at Julian. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the wall of lead-lined stone, his face carrying the expression she had come to recognize over the past 2 days as his characteristic expression. Not guilt, exactly, because the guilt was not his to carry in the primary sense, but the particular weariness of someone who has been in proximity to a wrong for their entire adult life and has absorbed it into their posture. She let him live here, Lydia said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Julian said, knowing she had the proof, knowing it was 30 feet beneath him. Yes, he paused. She moved to a rented room in the county seat in 1935 after the competency declaration. She lived there for 46 years until she died in 1981. She never came back to the farm. She never filed any legal challenge. She never told anyone where the room was. He looked at the vault door. She just let him live above it. The silence in the vault room was absolute. The lead-lined walls held the sound the way they held the moisture, completely without remainder. Lydia stood at the stone table and thought about a woman who had spent 20 years building a sealed room under the floor of the farm that had been taken from her, and had then spent the rest of her life in a rented room 40 minutes away, knowing that the man who had taken everything from her was living above the proof of what he had done, looking for it, unable to find it, unable to stop looking. Evelyn Sterling had understood something about justice that most people never arrived at. The law was one instrument, silence was another, and silence applied correctly and with sufficient patience could do what the law could not. It could make a man punish himself completely and continuously for the rest of his life. Julian reached into his coat pocket a second time. He removed a single key, the brass key, the one she had found in the wooden box in the first basement, the one she had left on the work table in the preservation room. He must have picked it up on his way through. He set it on the stone table beside the patent certificate and looked at her. "Take all of it," he said. His voice was even and final, the voice of a decision made a long time ago and only now being carried out. The documents, the notebooks, the photographs, the letters, everything in this room and everything in the room above, take it to whoever needs to see it to make this right. He looked at the patent certificate one more time at Evelyn Sterling's name in the inventor field. The ruby heart variety was never ours. The patent was never ours. The orchard's history was never ours. He paused. It was never ours from the first day. We just lived on top of it long enough to start believing it was. He looked at Lydia. "I'm 74 years old," he said. "I have 33 years of not opening that door to account for. I am not asking for anything. I'm only telling you that whatever you need from me to correct this record, I will provide it. Whatever acknowledgement is required. Whatever documentation." He stopped. "I don't want to die the way my grandfather died, looking for a room I already knew the contents of." He turned and went back to the spiral staircase. He climbed it slowly, one step at a time, in the careful, deliberate manner of a man who had come down, carrying something heavy, and was going back up without it. Lydia stood at the stone table in the vault room that Evelyn Sterling had built, and listened to his footsteps fade up through the iron treads above her. Then she reached for her notepad. There was work to do. Lydia found the guest cottage at the eastern edge of the property. She had not noticed it on her first walk of the grounds. It sat behind a stand of old apple trees that had grown close enough together to screen the structure from the main farmhouse, visible only from a specific angle on the eastern path that she had not taken until the morning after the vault was opened. A small building, one story, the clapboard, the same faded white as the main house, the proportions of a structure built for one person, living simply. A single window facing the orchard. A door with a plain iron latch. She tried the latch. It opened. Inside one room, the dimensions modest, the ceiling low. A narrow bed frame, the mattress long gone. A small cast-iron stove, cold and clean. A table by the window just wide enough for a person to work at the surface, marked with the rings of many cups and the faint scratches of a pen pressed firmly across paper over many years. A single shelf above the table, empty now, the wood slightly darker in several places, where jars had stood in consistent positions for a long period. She stood in the room for a moment. Everyone had assumed Marcus Sterling had allowed Evie to remain on the property out of something resembling mercy, a gesture toward the woman his legal maneuvers had dispossessed a minimum of human decency extended to the widow of his brother. Lydia had read this interpretation in the estate documents stated as background without examination, accepted without question by everyone who had subsequently handled the property. She had accepted it herself until this morning. She crossed to the table and crouched to examine the floor beneath it. The floorboards here were different from the rest of the room. She had noticed this when she entered, the slight variation in the wood's color and density, the boards slightly thicker than the surrounding floor. She pressed on one with her palm. It gave slightly, not from rot or structural failure, but from a different kind of looseness, the looseness of boards that had been lifted and replaced many times. She took out her flat blade and worked the edge into the seam. The board came up cleanly. The shallow space beneath it was dry and lined with a single sheet of oilcloth. On the oilcloth, a bundle of papers tied with the same cord she had encountered throughout the farm, the cord that Evie had apparently used consistently as a binding material across decades of archival work. She lifted the bundle onto the table and untied it. Purchase receipts, dozens of them covering a period from 1932 to 1941. 9 years of material acquisitions recorded in the systematic manner of a woman who kept records of everything as a professional habit and a personal discipline. She worked through them in chronological order, reading each one. Brick, various quantities purchased in 5 separate transactions from 3 different suppliers in 2 different counties. Structural steel, angle iron plate, and the spiral staircase components purchased under a different name entirely. Copper tube stock, suitable for document preservation cylinders. Lead sheeting the quantity consistent with the lining of a room approximately 12 feet square. Vault door hardware. She stopped at this receipt and read it twice. The supplier, a metalworks firm in a city 2 states away. The item described in the commercial language of industrial hardware, the name on the purchase order, one she had not encountered anywhere else in the Sterling records. Imarsh, a name chosen she understood for its complete dissociation from anything that could connect it to Evelyn Sterling or the Sterling property. A name that appeared nowhere in the county records, nowhere in the legal proceedings, nowhere in any document Marcus Sterling had access to. A name used once for each purchase and never repeated in exactly the same combination. She had paid in cash. The receipts recorded payment in full at the time of each transaction. Lydia spread the receipts across the work table and looked at them in sequence. Thaddeus had followed her to the cottage and was standing in the doorway looking at the table, reading the receipts from the distance with the expression of someone assembling a picture they had been carrying in incomplete form for a very long time. She stayed to watch the construction, Lydia said. It was not a question. She was simply saying aloud what the documents made clear. Marcus thought he was being generous. She stayed because the room wasn't finished yet. She had 3 more years of work to do after the competency declaration, Thaddeus said quietly. The vault door wasn't installed until 1934. The lead lining was the final element 1941 by my reading of those receipts. He paused. She lived in this cottage for 20 years after the declaration. She left in 1951 when the work was complete and the room was sealed and there was nothing more to do here. Lydia looked at the window facing the orchard. 20 years. Evelyn Sterling had lived in this single room for 20 years, within sight of the farm she had built, and the orchard she had developed and the farmhouse she had been removed from for the specific purpose of completing the work that would outlast everything Marcus had done to her. She had bought her materials under false names and paid in cash from a reserve that Marcus had not known existed and had built over 9 years of careful acquisition and construction, a room that was more permanent and more protected than anything else on the property. While Marcus Sterling ran the farm above her, while he filed his legal documents and managed his trust and maintained the fiction of his ownership and his creativity and his agricultural genius, while he slept 30 feet above the evidence of everything he had taken. Lydia found the second bundle beneath the second loose board. These were different personal papers. Rather than purchase receipts, the handwriting, the familiar precise script of Evie's research notebooks. Letters she realized reading the first one. Letters addressed to university agricultural departments, signed with the same false name as the purchase receipts, E. Marsh, the content dense with technical detail about apple breeding methodology and the development of specific flavor and disease resistance characteristics. The responses were there too. She found them in a separate fold. The letterhead of 3 different university departments, the replies addressed to E. Marsh at a postal address in the county seat, that was not the Sterling farm and not the cottage. A postal box she assumed maintained separately for this purpose. The universities had responded with interest. One letter from an agricultural college in Ohio described receiving seed samples from E. Marsh and achieving successful propagation results consistent with the described characteristics. A second, from a research station in Pennsylvania, acknowledged the technical sophistication of the breeding methodology described in E. Marsh's letters and requested additional correspondence. A third, dated 1948, reported that propagation trials of the E. Marsh varieties had produced results of sufficient interest to warrant inclusion in a regional breeding program. Evelyn Sterling had continued her work from a single room in a cottage at the edge of the farm that had been taken from her. She had grown trial specimens in containers. Lydia could see the evidence of this on the shelf above the table, the consistent circles where ceramic pots had stood over a long period. She had conducted her research, documented her results, and shared her findings with institutions that had no knowledge of her actual identity or her actual circumstances. She had died in this room in 1981 at the age of 78. The county death record listed her occupation as retired, her estate the contents of a single room. Lydia set the university letters on the table beside the purchase receipts. The picture that assembled itself from these two sets of documents was not the picture of a woman diminished by what had been done to her. It was the picture of a woman who had taken the circumstances she had been given and had continued without interruption the work she had always done, who had lost the farm and the patent and the legal recognition of her name, and had responded by building a vault and continuing her research and leaving both for whoever came after her. She had not been defeated. She had simply moved her laboratory underground. The last paper in the second bundle was a single sheet separate from the letters folded once. She unfolded it and read it in the light from the window that faced the orchard. The handwriting was older than the other documents, the script slightly less controlled. The pen pressure lighter, the writing of a woman in the last years of her life, setting down something she wanted to leave behind. Brick can crack, steel can rust, but truth is a variety of tree that always finds its way up through the ground. Lydia read it twice. Then she sat down in the chair at Evie's work table in the room where Evie had worked for 20 years in a cottage at the edge of her own orchard, and looked out through the single window at the apple trees, standing in their long rows in the October morning, the old rootstock still producing in its diminished way, after a century of unmanaged growth, still doing what it had been bred to do, still carrying in its cellular structure the work of the woman who had developed it and named it, and hidden the proof of her name 30 feet beneath the ground. The trees did not know they had been taken. They simply continued. The county cemetery was 3 miles from the farm. Lydia drove there in the late morning after the documents had been photographed and cataloged, and the vault room properly recorded, and Thaddeus had gone to make the first of what he said would be several calls to people who needed to hear what had been found. She drove alone, which felt correct. This particular errand was not a legal matter or an archival task. It was something else. The cemetery occupied a low rise east of the county road, the older sections marked by the particular irregularity of 19th century burial grounds. Stones of varying heights and materials, the spacing uneven, the paths between them, worn by 100 years of visiting rather than designed. She had obtained the plot number from the county vital records office that morning, the same call in which she had confirmed Evelyn Sterling's death date, and the absence of any obituary in the county newspaper archive. There had been no obituary. She found Marcus Sterling's monument before she found Evie's grave. It was impossible to miss. In the central section of the cemetery on the highest ground of the low-rise, a marble monument approximately 5 feet tall, the kind of memorial that announced its subject's importance before you read the inscription. Marcus Sterling, 1878 to 1979, devoted to family and community, a pillar of Sterling County agriculture. The marble was clean, the inscription sharp, the plot well maintained with the evidence of regular attention. Someone had been tending this grave consistently. She stood in front of it for a moment, reading the inscription once and then turned away. She found Evie's grave in the northeast corner of the cemetery. The northeast corner was the oldest section, the stones here dating primarily from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the plot smaller and more closely spaced than the central section. The grass was longer here, the paths less defined. The overall character of a section that received less regular attention than the more prominent areas. She walked the rows with the plot number written in her notepad and found the stone in the 3rd row from the back fence. It was small. Not the smallest in the section, but modest, a simple rectangular marker, the granite gray, and undistinguished the dimensions of a standard county-issue burial marker from the period. The surface was almost entirely covered in moss, the growth thick and undifferentiated, obscuring the carved letters beneath it completely. She would not have been able to read the name without clearing it. She crouched and took the soft brush from her bag, the same brush she used for cleaning archival documents, and began to work the moss away from the stone surface. She worked slowly from the top downward, the way she approached any surface that needed careful cleaning. The moss released in sections, the granite beneath it gray, and sound the carving intact under the growth. The name emerged gradually. Evelyn Rose Sterling, 1903 to 1981, No additional inscription, no dates of marriage or family relationships, no occupation, no acknowledgement, no record of anything she had done or made or contributed or lost. 2 dates and a name, the minimum the county required, the absolute floor of memorial acknowledgement. Lydia sat back on her heels and looked at the cleared stone. From her coat pocket, she took the apple she had picked that morning from one of the old trees in the orchard's eastern row, a small fruit, the skin the deep red with the faint underlying gold that Evie's Generation 12 breeding records had described as the target characteristic of the ruby heart variety. She had picked it from a tree that was still producing, still carrying in its rootstock the genetic work of the woman whose grave she was now sitting beside. She set it at the base of the headstone against the granite, the red of the skin bright against the gray of the stone. She opened her notepad to the page where she had copied Samuel Sterling's will that morning. She read it aloud. Not the legal language, the handwritten addendum at the bottom of the final page, in Samuel's own words, the words he had written 4 months before he died, in the plain human language of a man who wanted to be understood rather than legally precise. She read it at the pace it deserved, each sentence complete before the next. Evie built this farm. Everything here is hers. It has always been hers. I am only confirming what was already true. The cemetery was quiet around her. The old apple trees at the eastern boundary of the property, she had not noticed them when she arrived, but they were there, a row of old trees planted along the fence line. Their branches extending over the boundary into the cemetery itself moved slightly in the October wind. She closed the notepad. "You were not patient number 402, she said. She had found the number in the psychiatric facility's admission records in Thaddeus's satchel, the administrative designation assigned to Evelyn Sterling upon her admission to the Millhaven County Psychiatric Facility in November 1931. Patient 402. The clinical reduction of a person to a number, the administrative machinery of an institution processing what a lawyer had delivered to its door. "You are Evelyn Rose Sterling," Lydia said. "Botanist, geneticist, agricultural scientist, the developer of the Ruby Heart apple variety and the holder of its original patent, the designer and builder of Sterling Orchard's breeding program from 1918 to 1932 and beyond, the architect of a vault that outlasted everyone who tried to erase you." She paused. "The architect of everything we are looking at." The wind moved through the apple trees along the fence line. She had always found it difficult to characterize the sound of wind through apple trees. It was different from wind through other trees, something in the density and arrangement of the leaves producing a quality of sound that was quieter and more continuous than the sound of larger trees, less dramatic and more sustained. Standing in the northeast corner of the cemetery, with the cleared headstone before her and the ruby heart apple at its base, she found herself thinking of it as the closest thing to applause that a quiet person would allow. She took out her camera. She had brought it specifically for this, not the phone camera she had been using for documentation throughout the week, but the proper camera she used for archival photography, the one that produced images suitable for official records. She framed the headstone carefully, the name fully legible in the cleared granite, the apple at the base, the apple trees visible beyond the fence line in the background. Justice was not only the return of money or property or legal standing. She had known this in the abstract for most of her professional life, had known it in the way that archivists know things about the documents they handle through long proximity to records of what people had done to each other and what had eventually come to light. But standing in this corner of the county cemetery with a cleared headstone and a ruby heart apple and a copied will in her notepad, she understood it more specifically. Justice was the return of a name to the person it belonged to. It was the act of saying in a form that would enter the record and remain there, "This person existed, this person did this work. This person was here and was real and built something that outlasted the people who tried to erase her." She pressed the shutter. The image recorded a cleared gray headstone, the name Evelyn Rose Sterling fully legible. A single red apple at its base, old apple trees in the background, carrying in their rootstock the genetic work of the woman whose name was on the stone. She took 3 more frames from different angles, making sure the name was legible in each one. Then she sat beside the headstone in the October morning and looked at the apple trees for a while. If you've been with Evie's story this far, if something in it has stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Truth can be buried, but it always finds its way up through the ground. The gathering was held on a Saturday in November. Not a ceremony. Lydia had been precise about this when she spoke with the County Historical Society and with the Agricultural Registry representative and with the reporter from the regional paper who had called after the initial records correction had been filed. She had used the word gathering each time deliberately and had explained the distinction when asked. A ceremony implied an institution taking credit for an outcome. What had happened here had not been institutional. It had been one woman following a paper trail that another woman had laid 90 years ago with extraordinary care and extraordinary patience, and the acknowledgement of that should feel like what it was personal, specific, proportionate to the thing being recognized. The morning was cold and clear, the November sky, the particular hard blue of a season that had finished negotiating and arrived at its final position. The old apple trees stood in their rows, with the stripped clarity of late autumn, the last of the season's fruit, long since fallen, the branch structure visible now in its full complexity after months of being obscured by leaves. Lydia had arrived before anyone else, as she had at every significant moment in this process, to stand in the place alone before it became shared. She stood in the orchard for a while. The records correction had taken 6 weeks from the date of the vault opening, 6 weeks of legal filings and archival submissions, and the particular administrative patience required to move a correction through multiple institutional systems simultaneously. Thaddeus had managed the legal components with the focused energy of a man redeeming 30 years of inaction in a compressed period of time. The county recorder's office had processed the title correction. The Agricultural Patent Registry had formally amended its records. The State Historical Society had accepted the full documentation. The Ruby Heart apple variety was now officially credited in the National Patent Record to Evelyn Rose Sterling, sole inventor, Sterling Orchard, Virginia, 1928. Her name, in the record, permanent. The people came in ones and twos throughout the morning. Thaddeus arrived first on foot, again the leather satchel over his shoulder, empty now, its contents delivered to the proper authorities and properly archived. He had aged visibly in the 6 weeks since the vault opening, but the aging had the quality of relief rather than deterioration. He looked like a man who had set down something heavy and whose body was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. Julian Sterling came alone, as he had come to everything connected to this process. He had been present at each step, the records filings, the patent correction, the historical society registration, quietly, consistently, without attempting to position himself as part of the resolution rather than part of the problem. He had done what he said he would do. He had provided documentation, signed acknowledgments, submitted the written statement to the Historical Society, confirming his family's knowledge of the vault's existence and their decision not to open it. He had done all of it without being asked twice for anything. The scholarship fund had been his own idea. He had mentioned it to Lydia in a phone call 3 weeks after the vault opening, briefly, without elaboration, in the manner of someone describing a decision already made, rather than proposing one for discussion. He would be directing the majority of the Sterling family's remaining agricultural assets toward an endowment for women in agricultural science administered through the State University's Agricultural College, named for Evelyn Sterling. The first awards would be given in the spring. Lydia had not commented on this. Some things did not require comment. The sign had been installed the previous afternoon. She had designed it herself, plain wood. The lettering carved rather than painted, mounted at the entrance to the drive, where the old unmarked post had stood since she first arrived. She had kept the design simple because Evie had kept everything simple, had built her work on function and precision rather than presentation, and the sign that bore her name should reflect the same values. Evie's Legacy Orchard, established 1891. Below the name smaller, in honor of Evelyn Rose Sterling, botanist, geneticist, developer of the Ruby Heart apple, 1903 to 1981. Lydia had stood in front of it for a long time the previous afternoon after the stonemason left. The third basement was open. She had made this decision deliberately and had discussed it with the Historical Society and with Julian and with Thaddeus before proceeding. The vault door stood as it had stood since the morning Thaddeus turned the key open. The mechanism disengaged the steel surface cold and present in the beam of the lighting she had installed along the spiral staircase and throughout the preservation room and the vault room itself. The lead-lined walls, the stone table, the copper cylinder empty now, its contents in proper archival storage, a reproduction set in its place on the table for visitors who came down through the 3 levels. The vault door would not be closed again. It was not a secret anymore. It was a record, a physical record of what one woman had built and why, and at what cost, and with what patience, a record that existed in 3 dimensions and could be walked through and stood in and understood in the specific way that only physical spaces allowed understanding. The jar labels were still on the shelves in the preservation room. The notebooks were still on the work table, the originals in archival storage and reproductions in their place, open to specific pages that Lydia had selected because they showed the work most clearly, the precise entries, the systematic documentation, the 40-year record of a mind that had never stopped doing what it was built to do, regardless of what had been done to it. Evie's portrait hung at the base of the spiral staircase. She had chosen this location carefully at the point where the visitor descended from the preservation room into the vault level. The portrait was the first thing seen. Evie, as she had been in 1892, standing at the entrance of the farmhouse, the east window arch, visible behind her, looking directly into the camera with the expression that Lydia had spent a long time reading and had finally understood was not defiance and not fear and not performance. It was certainty. The certainty of a woman who knew exactly where she was standing and exactly what she had built and understood already in 1892 that the building of it was the most important thing she would ever do, and that the record of it would outlast everything else. In the afternoon, when the formal presentations had been made, and the Historical Society representative had spoken, and Julian had said the few words he had prepared, and Thaddeus had said nothing, but had stood in the front row throughout with his hands folded and his eyes forward, Lydia walked the orchard alone. The harvest had been modest this year. The trees had been unmanaged for too long to produce at their historical capacity, and the restoration of the orchard to proper production would take years of careful work. But the fruit that had come in had been what the jar labels and the breeding records had promised. The deep red skin with its underlying gold, the particular density of the flesh, the flavor profile that Evie's Generation 12 notes had described in the specific technical language of a scientist who was also paying attention to beauty. She picked one from the last tree in the eastern row and held it in both hands. 3 basements, not for gold or silver or the material wealth that other hidden rooms in other old houses had concealed. 3 basements built for one purpose: to protect a name, to preserve a record, to ensure that the truth of what one woman had done would survive everything that had been done to erase it. Evelyn Sterling had understood something that her brother-in-law had spent 30 years failing to understand. You could take a person's property. You could take their legal standing, their freedom, their public credit, their name from every document accessible to ordinary inspection. You could reduce them to a number in an institutional record and a modest stone in a corner of a cemetery. But you could not take what they had built into the ground itself. The ruby heart apple trees stood in their rows in the November light, the rootstock carrying in its cellular structure the work of the woman who had bred it, carrying it the way living things carry the work of the people who made them without memory and without ceremony, simply by continuing to be what they had been made to be. Lydia stood among them for a long time. Then she took her camera out of her coat pocket and photographed the sign at the entrance to the drive, the late afternoon light falling across the carved letters, the name clear and permanent in the November air. Evie's Legacy Orchard. 3 basements were not built to hide a treasure of gold or silver. They were built to protect something worth more than either the dignity of a woman's name and the truth of her work. And now, at last, under an open sky and an open vault door, Evelyn Rose Sterling could finally rest in the light she had always deserved. If you believe Evie Sterling earned this justice, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, would you have the courage to go down into the third basement of your own family's history? I want to know.